Doing okay. Had a Japanese conversation lesson last night and had a hard time. Hadn't been able to practice particularly well as of late. But that's okay. Part of it all. I like it. I like it. How do you practice conversation lessons?
受付で会いましょう。
受付で会いましょう。受付で会いましょう。We should meet up at the front desk. 受付で会いましょう。The day threes are pretty relaxed most of the time, and if I relax, it's not as bad, or I don't pause as much. Oh, this is one that I missed. Iriguchi. Oh no, wait, no, that's from the last unit. Never mind. It's not part of the total recall of yesterday. Iriguchi, the entrance is part of the first half. Iriguchi.
入り口。
入り口は何回ですか?
何回?
Yeah, usually it's just having a lesson with a teacher who will help correct your mistakes. I see. Usually you have to come up with conversation topics too, which is always a bit interesting. Oh, I do love that type of thing. That is usually what I stick with as well. Not for language lessons, but for other things. So oftentimes when I have acquaintances or soon to be friends or people who I want to establish a deeper relationship with, I generally, when they're very reserved, I tend to take the initiative, and that's usually how that works out too. Like, oh hey, if we're gonna meet every day, try to bring a conversation topic, right? It's not only effective for language use. It's kind of, I'm sure you've heard me say it to a couple of strangers already. When someone comes by and say, I'm learning Duolingo in Japanese, learning Japanese in Duolingo as well. I say, well, hey, you know what? What would be a very fun exercise if when you learn something, feel free to stop by for a minute or two and tell me about what was interesting in your day, like using Duolingo. And often not only encourages language learning, which oftentimes mechanically people may find that as the basic requirement, it usually improves communication skills. And communication skills, in my opinion, supersede, it kind of supersedes, but it also follows language learning. So ultimately, regardless of how well you command your language, you also need the communication skills to use it, right? Like you need interesting combos or like ways you want to speak or different ways you want to speak, maybe surprise the person that you're talking to. And even new topics. I like this thing that I want to talk about. A lot of times people think they need new topics to be interesting. However, being able to communicate old topics in different ways are also quite interesting. So you might be able to talk about Duolingo for 61 days and still sound like you're interested in Duolingo. What does that sound like? Oh, right. That's what I'm doing. I'm just kidding. That was a little facetious. Sorry. Yeah, totally. I'm a bit weak on both, so it's a bit of an interesting combo. That's extra bonus points, in my opinion. So when you said you had a hard time, but you say it's okay, it's part of the process, that means you did extra work. You put in extra efforts, and you're getting lots of gains. Far more gains than if you said, oh, it felt really comfortable. It felt like I did the same thing, and I'm really getting my act together. Like it felt like a breeze, like sometimes it's great to get affirmation for all the things, but it sounded like to me, it sounded like you worked really hard and then you still found it okay. And that's awesome, right? To me, that's awesome. That sounds like someone who is constantly improving. And definitely do not rest on their laurels. So kudos, Lotus. Very, very encouraging. Makes me want to work harder, actually. I haven't been working too hard the last 2 or 3 days because of Duolingo being too casual with relying on the same patterns. Yankee desu. Nice. And what are you up to, Hen? When you mention teacher, that's kind of how I sound. If I were to teach anything, I tend to sound like that all the time. So I kind of activated teacher mode a little bit there. Like, generally speaking, it's far more consistent for a teacher to acknowledge that someone is having a hard time, embracing that they're having a hard time, and reminding them that having a hard time also means they are aware of everything they're possibly working on, and they will improve incredibly. As opposed to, a student that says, yeah, this is boring, like, I'm not learning anything. It's like, that's on me. Sometimes I feel like that's on me because I'm not providing the challenge, and then also partially because that person is not motivated to go beyond whatever the system that I've provided. In fact, that student probably could teach me a thing on engaging them. Oftentimes when I see a student that's very bored, comfort, and kind of just progressively becoming more apathetic, that's a reflection upon me as well as a student. So oftentimes to remediate that, I typically ask what their interests are, and then we can frame the stuff around their interest. If they are disinterested, I must culture myself in order to engage them. Like, if it's a one-on-one thing. And the most recent type of teaching or mentoring that I've ever done is mentoring. So it's not in a large classroom setting. These are techniques that and insecurities that I'm expressing in a more of a one-on-one or shadowing or mentoring relation. Yeah, as a teacher, it seems difficult to not be able to control how much the students care. Yeah, so it takes a really big risk to invest a lot of time to make sure that you ask the student if there's any willingness that they're able to share some of their interests, and then framing the stuff around their interests helps you be creative and helps your communication, right? Teachers do fail in a communication department if they specifically focuses on what they believe is optimal and what they believe is the approach, right? If you keep bootstrapping that, then you'll be really consistent for sure. However, all the students that do not care as much, they'll fall by the wayside. So it's really up to you how you juggle the moralities and your display of self. For me, I tend to favor the bottom line approach. If I can engage the least engaged student and continue to work on that, then I can at least provide engaging content for the rest, because the rest of the students are likely engaged. So I tend to, it kind of sounds like special treatment. However, typically what I learn from the least engaged students, I try to use that as inspiration to further engage the students that are already engaged, right? So I already know what engages them, so I need to learn how to engage the students that aren't at the moment. And oftentimes the students that don't care or are bored, they're actually the ones that are they're accelerated way past the rest of the class. Like, it's not often it's because they're underperforming, or they're often pretty talented students and largely unmotivated to use that. So oftentimes I feel more comfort when a student says, this is really hard, and they continue to try, versus this is really easy, it's boring, I'm over it, it's time to quit. That's can be a beginning alarming signs of red flags regarding someone, because being dismotivated chronically tends to mean that they will become more and more selective over time. So they don't choose to work on skills they don't want to, and it's easier to be apathetic when you're spending most of your time deciding what's important to you and not listening to anyone. Kind of a fun little deep cut into teaching. I always wanted to. I consider picking up some like tutoring jobs in the future, maybe. I really like interacting with case by case stuff. Yeah, that's cool that you have a teacher. Is this like a company related thing because you're going to Japan soon? Or is this your personal venture of having a Japanese teacher or a Japanese language teacher? I'm looking forward to working with you. Wait, I've already forgotten. よろしくお願いします。
よろしくお願いします。
ミーティングは何回ですか？
ミ
ミーティングは何回ですか？Oh, right. ただ。ミーティングは何時からですか？
ミーティング
は何時からですか？
何時からですか？
プリンターはどこですか？プリンター
はどこですか？
ですか？
Oh, do you feel like you've been carried right now by being able to use wa instead of a specific particle? Me? Being carried? What do you mean by being carried? I actually think the choices that they use wa here is important because they're the stuff that I would actually use wa here instead of like ni in some places and o in some places. You don't have to understand other particles? That's fair. Like not using other particles. My thought whenever they use wa, when I'm using wa is can this be a ni or can this be a de? A te? Or sorry, de or an o. So I don't ever think about it as I'm using the wa now. I usually, whenever I pick a particle, I'm asking myself what other particles can go there. So I don't think I feel carried, but at the same time, it's very comfort when it comes to particles. So I no longer feel like I need a crutch in any way. Most of the time I'm asking myself this question. I don't voice it out loud anymore because it's become very routine. Although there's a alternative perspective on this. Duo actually use wa very specifically here. So like they're not using it to avoid something. Or they're not using it to avoid learning something. They're using it to avoid being specific a lot of times. Like for example, one that happens a lot is they use wa because of question. Or when ka is being used as a question marker. However, I know recently, at least there are two. It's more of an unknown marker. Ka is an unknown marker. Uptone is more of a question marker. So you could say this as without the uptone and it would mean something different. However, a lot of times for duo specifically, wa is preferred when they use ka at the end of the like sentence question thing. At the end of a clause. So this is what I'm thinking when they use wa, if that helps. I don't know if that's considered being carried or not. But one thing that duo, it's a duoism. So I'm becoming, I guess this is part of Duolingo fluency, right? Yeah. So whenever is this, they default to wa because they think of it more conceptually as a topic, like a suggestion or a lighter thing that's non-specific. There are occasions where they throw in what overrides this preference is often when there's a specific predicate or phrase that requires like a ni or an o sometimes. But they actually flip the o into a wa when, or ha, however you want to, a wa whenever it becomes a question. So a lot of times like eat, like tabemasu, right? Say like sushi o tabemasu, or like I eat sushi, right? So when it say do you eat sushi, it flips to a wa. So it's one of those things that I kind of like it, but these are the things I think about whenever that happens. It happens so frequently that I no longer say it out loud. I might get back into the habit of saying all these things out loud. Anyways, thanks for asking. The answer is yes and no. Yes, because wa is pretty all-purpose and you're not actually using other particles. That's a fair point. Does it help understand other particles? No, because you're only using wa. However, I'm thinking more than just using the wa most of the time. Gozen no, like every time no comes out as well. So every time no comes out, I'm asking myself, is this quote unquote fossilized? Yeah. And I'm keeping track of what no is nominalizing, right? Or if it's not nominalized. So I'm taking account of this and this every time no comes up, just to keep track of all the different combinations. And in this case, yeah, you have the wa again, right? I don't know enough to be comfortable using something other than a wa here, but I suppose you could use a ni? Yes. This is a time? Maybe? I don't know. I don't know enough, so I wouldn't be confident in using something other than that. But yes.
9時から
Fujikara desu. So I would love for them to in a different way, I would love them to experiment more with particles so I can see more patterns and particle use patterns. I look forward to seeing if they introduce the other two functions of ka. Yesterday I was doing my evening grammar read and it was an article on ka. So as an unknown marker. I like my use case for ka in the future was probably either or, right? Neither, either or. I would love to be able to see examples in Duolingo using ka as an unknown marker for that. To answer the 15-minute ago question from before my boss walked in. Okay, Lotus. You're just hiring a teacher one-off on italki. Okay, italki. Okay. Okay, fair enough. I should consider that in the future. It would be kind of fun. Although you wouldn't be able to see me do that kind of thing, right? So that's kind of... There's one big restriction on the stuff that I'm using. One big conditional on the stuff I'm using to show this stuff is that I can't show it. So oftentimes that is the biggest restriction. So a lot of people constantly ask things like use LingQ, use have you test other things. I can't show that. So I'm not a YouTube content creator. As in, like, what I mean is I don't make short form or semi short form or long form content. That is not my intent. It doesn't illustrate my primary goal of working on something for a very long time. Oh, sure. Are you comfortable with having that? Whoops. Yeah. Thanks. Are you comfortable with that link being there? Okay. I wanted to make sure beforehand. So I'll put this aside for later. Okay. I kind of forgot that it opens up, and so okay. Thank you, Lotus. Thank you. All right. I'll take a look. And it looks like it's all in it's scary. Okay. Oh, is this like your notes for... Oh my goodness. Oh my. All right. That will... Okay. I will attempt to like read... Oh, that's... You know what? This is like a great decoding thing. You know what this would make a great exercise for? Yeah, she writes down the gist of the conversation and highlights issues. Okay, so I actually think this would be cool to do together sometime. A bit down the road, I already see 4 things that I need to look up. But we could do this live sometime in the future. You know, like take your conversations, and as I'm doing it, I would try to like first go over what it actually says to me first. Okay, this is good. I like this. I'm gonna mark this. I'm gonna bookmark this for now. Okay. That's... I have an idea. Yeah. And then what that does is I can actually get direct feedback from you, if you know what I mean. Like, you are the person who's involved in it, so you actually technically is the expert in this situation. So we'll have to think about that. I'll keep that in mind. I'll probably look at it myself for the time being, but a little bit further down the road, I think it would be fun to spend some amount of time trying to like get your guidance through it and seeing what I can do with like a Gshow and all the other resources I have, gshow.org and stuff, to see if I can, comprehend what the notes mean. And honestly, that's kind of interesting because comprehending notes is a very different type of dynamics than having a conversation and also reading stuff, right? I don't know if you've ever read anyone else's notes. It requires some of the highest level of comprehension. Like, for example, you go to class and you miss the class and you ask your friend for their notes. That is legitimately one of the hardest tasks, to try to comprehend someone else's notes, like without control and whatnot. So I actually think that would be really interesting to see if I can even garner 1 or 2 sentences out of your notes. Yeah, definitely someone else's chemistry notes I have to read like 4 times. Yeah, I actually think that's one of the highest order of understanding, that even in a native language, it's so difficult to understand someone else's like shorthand, like I have shorthand in notes. They're well organized, but they're incredibly shorthanded. So when someone asks like, why does this one word, what does this one word mean? It doesn't have any context. Like, well, it does have context, and I explain it, but it's like, but that's just one word. So yeah, note taking can be absurdly nuanced, like incredibly nuanced, probably even to a greater extent than talking to your close friends with inside jokes. Like, it's almost as selective as that. When you talk to a close friend, you start cutting phrases, you only say like a couple words and they mean like 8 billion different things because you share memories and there's too many subtexts and inside jokes. Then you get to notes, and I'm like, how does writing fish remind you of Superman? Excuse me? Like, oh no, I draw a fish to remind me of Avogadro's number, and I'm like, okay, all right. I suppose that works. I do it all the time though. I read a lot of people's notes because sometimes improving note taking or something in different ways. And when I mean by improving note taking, it's not focused on how to take the notes. It's how to increase the meaning of notes. So some people often say like, I don't get it. Is it because my notes are bad? Like, am I taking bad notes? And I ask them like, so how are you taking notes? And their response, a lot of times, ones that are struggling, is, oh, I try to remember everything. So I try to write everything down. Okay. Slow down. When you write everything down, are you able to write everything down? First of all, like, you ask the person, right? Do you feel like you're able to write everything down? And 90 to 95% of the time, the person would say, no, that's where I'm struggling. I can't write everything down. All right. Let's focus on what you can do right now. So how can you capture more of the stuff by sacrificing what you can't do right now, right? If your goal is to write everything down and it's not happening, how can we work towards increasing your efficiency in any way? And a lot of times it would be very mechanical at first, like take pictures, record audio, simplify words, right? Use keywords that are grouped together in meaning, so that whenever someone says something like, what words can you eliminate from your notes? As in, how do you shorthand more? Don't, focus on things you can sacrifice without losing much of the meaning. So things like, oh, and then he went, and then he wrote this stuff. Oh, he noticed that the professor constantly says this phrase. You don't need that phrase anymore then, because it's always implied. So that's kind of like how Anji, the compression works. So over time, the notes become more and more shorthand. And that's ultimately why it's incredibly impressive when you talk to someone who takes good notes, as in the person that takes very good notes. Oftentimes, those notes are so efficient, it can be very difficult to understand. And the one thing about that is, this is the paradox with note taking. The common stereotype or misconception is that the person who understands the most has the most comprehensive notes, as in the person who understands the most is likely to write everything down. It's actually quite the opposite. The person who is most knowledgeable about the topic is incredibly efficient, and their notes are incredibly subtextual. They don't spend a lot of time needing to write everything down. So all like single words, single examples. For me, my notes, what do my notes look like? They're only examples. So oftentimes I would say, if someone asked me for my notes, I'm like, if you need me to be there, like I could go through all of this with you instead. So oftentimes I more prefer to be the person who is actively involved in helping the person as opposed to passing the notes. I would make time to explain my notes. I only record examples because through the examples, it's implicit what, to me, it's implicit what all that is showing. So basically, it's like doing your homework. So when someone looks at my notes, like, why is your notes only the how to solve all the homework questions? It's like, because that's how I remember all the concepts. I don't bother explicitly telling me what the concept is. If I can solve the problem and think about the problem in many different ways, then I already understand the concept. So my notes are I remember a few times in my life where someone asked me for my notes and they largely just looked at me and was like, well, this is just the homework. I'm like, yes, it is the homework. That's why I like homework. I like doing homework and doing questions and stuff and then writing about what I'm doing or what I learned from those things. And the professor, I go into class, I sit there and I listen to the professor. That's about it. Sometimes I write down funny things I notice about the professor, like, oh yeah, like observations about the person teaching. Like, man, the person really likes this topic. I'm gonna make a note that they really like this topic because that'll be effective in getting a good grade. If my goal is to get a good grade, I focus on what's important to the professor, not what I need to know. Generally speaking, I already know what I need to know. It's not required for me. So oftentimes my notes focus on what the professor emphasizes over and over again. And I do exams at the professor, not the professor telling me new things. It might not be the same for everyone else, but generally that's how I learn. I study the person most of the time because the semantic knowledge comes, it comes and goes. It's much like how I'm approaching Japanese. I prefer to know the people using Japanese. I prefer to know the people who are learning Japanese, and everything else comes about it. If I interact with people who learn Japanese all the time, I will learn most of their strategies. I will be exposed to most of their strategies. It'll come naturally. So much like immersion and, talking to a Japanese teacher, if you spend a lot of time with someone, you inherently have a selective advantage in getting most of their experience. So instead of juggling like, oh yeah, did I learn the right way or did I... It's, in my opinion, secondary. Very secondary. I love talking about this stuff. Sorry. I kind of digressed a little. I wasn't going to digress today because today is review day. But perhaps that might inspire some people to think about studying in a different way. I absolutely love mentorship, but I'm biased. I'm also biased because I had the privilege of going to higher education, especially higher education that emphasizes mentorship. And so it's not about what is the best way, what is whatever optimal or stuff. It's about finding a great way to balance your interest and taking advantage of whatever is offered to you. Meanwhile, I can't really show that, right? So Duolingo is as good as anything. Oftentimes people always ask me like, well, why don't you do this? And I'm like, can I stream it? Because the valuable thing is not Duolingo. The valuable thing I like to believe is me, right? Otherwise, if I want to learn Japanese the best way, I would stop streaming. I would stop recording myself. There's an absolute, if I'm hyper pragmatic, I should stop streaming and do all the things everyone recommends. It's so interesting how few people understand the what's in front of them. As in, you're observing a streamer recording the use of Duolingo. Now ask yourself when you give an advice, oh yeah, Try LingQ. LingQ is the best. Or try Cure what was it? Cure Dolly. And I'm like, Cure Dolly is an intellectual property of someone else. I can't be guaranteed that using their stuff and whatnot, I wouldn't like sometime down the road it's like, oh well, you made money or you took things and liberties from our property. It's the first thing, right? I love this Dogen's skit that I watched yesterday, and he talked about he has a gag at the end, but he was being quite serious in the middle of it, in most of it. And it's the idea that Japan has all these good stuff. It's like this, it's really good, all this food is good, but the reality is the food that people are talking about is targeted towards Japanese people. Like, oh yeah, this sushi is so good because it's fatty. It highlights all the things because it's targeted. So if you understand what the media is using to target them, you understand what the motivations and purpose and intent of it. And it can reveal a lot of things. And that's usually what I mean by oftentimes when people offer advice, they offer what they think the person is doing. But if you step back a little and ask, the first question is, I'm watching a streamer use Duolingo. So what does a streamer who spends many hours streaming Duolingo, what are the questions and purposes that they have to do prior to doing anything else? And to me, that's the mantra of process-oriented thinking, right? So if your end goal thinking and immediately jumping to conclusion that my primary goal is to learn Japanese, right? That's the end goal. Sure. That's fine. That's easier. It takes less effort, honestly. Honestly, in 90% of the time, it's easier to view someone's intent at the end goal. If you are process-oriented, the first question you would ask is, why did he choose? Why did this streamer choose Duolingo? Well, obviously, it's for the end goal of learning Japanese. That's not it. What was the first step? Well, the first step is, hey, this guy's a streamer. What can they stream? Duolingo is one of them. So, what else can they stream? Well, a lot of times, 90% of this advice is things that I am unsure I can stream in the first place. So, order matters. The order matters all the time to me. And that goes with learning Japanese, having a great rapport with your teacher. If you, like, for example, process-oriented thinking. Okay, you don't like the teacher. You don't like the teacher, right? But you tell yourself, I need to learn something. So you skip this and say, I'm just going to learn anyways. Right? And some students, what happens is they don't like the teacher so much, they don't learn anything, regardless of how hard they try. Oftentimes, I found that if I am likable, so in the reverse perspective, so this is the student's perspective. In the reverse order, if I can't make students adherently or intuitively find me likable, as in good communication, shared interest, if any of those are like missing, it doesn't matter what you're teaching them. If you're teaching them anything, they're not going to listen to you. So this is like end goal. If your end goal is, oh, I'm hired to do a job, I have to teach whatever 10 units. All right, let's just get on it. Let's just skip over trying to be interesting to your students. So how does that impact your overall goal? It's up to you, obviously. Most teachers say, it's my job. I teach you 10 units. It's not my problem if the student doesn't care or doesn't engage, I'm paid to do a job, and that's fair enough. That's actually very fair. And that's not that much different from someone who goes around and say, I use Anki, Iridali, and what was the other one? Yamatin? I don't know. One of those. Like, throw in whatever buzzwords you have. You're not creating rapport with the person. So I honestly appreciate this approach. I don't use it myself. If someone ever asks me for help, you're going to sit down with me for at least a week so I can understand all the things, at least adequately understand all the things that are currently working. You don't think it's working, and feeling out the person, right? That's why I can't talk to thousands of people. I don't. That's not gonna happen. It's definitely not gonna happen. But yeah, gotta be encouraging, or gotta be appropriate. I think the word I want to use is appropriateness. Can't resonate with someone? Well, you can't teach them then. If you want to help someone, you have to connect with the person first. You can choose to gamble, though. It can happen, right? It can happen. If you gamble, I would say if your advice is based on expert advice that's based on gigantic pools of data, you're more than likely to be consistent, right? You will be consistent. So all the time-tested things, so very optimized things. Throw your dice. Sometimes you land. Most times you land. Sometimes you fail. Which is why the people that come in and say you ought to do X aren't going to have the best lesson to teach right away. Indeed. And for me, my goal is, well, if they went out of their way to come in and say something, I'm gonna at least try to take some value from them, right? It's not like they're giving me, if it makes them feel better that they're giving me value, that's perfectly fine. But I'm there to capitalize on someone's experience. It's free experience. So if they're really angry about Duolingo, it's free experience. You might be thinking, okay, someone's really angry at Duolingo. How do I use that to my advantage? Well, I analyze what the arguments they have, what the tendencies they have, and the language that they use. And whenever I meet another person who's angry at Duolingo, I learned from the first person what makes them angry. So I use that information to better communicate for future. Even if it's a conflict of interest, there's some value to understanding what your opponents are. So most of the time, I prefer to be working hard on opponents as opposed to the other way around. That's largely what, if someone asks me one of the maybe 5 hallmarks of someone who's gone through a PhD, is that you farm your opponents. Rarely is the case that you need to ever focus on your own position if you can farm your opponents. That is the natural state of a PhD. You can't get a PhD without being able to understand all your counter arguments, all your peers who yeah, I know. I threw it in because, gamer speak, right? I gotta lower down in a more intellectual way. It would be to your peers offer you the biggest resilience to your data. So if you can address all your opponents, as in all your critics, that inevitably will strengthen your own stance and reveal a lot about how to strengthen your methodology and approaches. So my learning, I'm not an expert in any of the things that I've said so far, learning, mentoring, and stuff. The way I gathered most of these experiences And the way I'm consistently, I think, consistently able to appear like I understand what I'm speaking is often because I'm looking for information from everyone. I'm not projecting what I know. I rarely project unless someone asks me directly for what I know. I'm actually communicating all the information that I've observed and people have spoken to me. So whenever I say things like, oh yeah, oh, I remember kata, it's because 10 other people mentioned kata by passing, right? So, oh yeah, I remember the no stuff because of X, Y, and Z person. So most of the time I'm actually borrowing all the knowledge because I spend more time taking in everyone's thing. If I ever go and sell something or do something professionally, you'll probably know. I haven't ever done anything like uniquely me, except for when I was drawing. Oh, actually, even when I'm drawing, like Inktober stuff, all the prompts, I tell people where my inspirations come from. And exactly what I'm doing. It's not my own original idea. Originality comes naturally when you're spending more time collecting information, in my opinion, because they'll eventually synthesize into something that's hard to mimic. So what is hard to mimic in the learning language, learning Japanese thing, according to native like speakers? What is unique about me, I suppose? Well, I do pretty much a lot of what they do, and I use Duolingo. And if that's not unique enough, then I don't know. I'm multilingual, technically. So, do I project multilingualist? No. What about Japanese? I like Romaji. Right? So it's all of the above. The more I collect, the more the unlikely case that someone is going to be able to pick any specific thing to argue against. Because, like, for example, native like would say Duolingo is awful. Duolingo is awful. And since I use Duolingo, I asked them, when did you use Duolingo for Japanese? Right? And then they're going to say, well, I used it back in 2022. Well, 2023, post 2023 Duolingo is different than post 2022. So objectively, can you prove that 2022 is the same as 2023? Axiomatically, your basis for your entire objective review is incorrect. That is the scientific method, right? What is the first section of every journal article? It's the introduction, the current state of the product or the methodology you're using. You have to thoroughly be up to date in order to present an objective case, right? So that's kind of what I try to do most of the time. So a lot of people would say, well, Romaji is a crutch. It's like, well, okay. What is the current state of Romaji, right? Even I don't know that. But I can tell you one thing. People still use it on keyboard. That in itself, they have to address, well, how do you convince people to discard Romaji for keyboard? And then that'll take them down a rabbit hole of economics, manufacturing, like keyboard manufacturers, Windows OS. It keeps going. Like, it's easier to ask questions as an opponent than projecting your own advice. Generally when it comes to mentorship and teaching and advice, I try to ask the most relevant questions, because I personally do not doubt the person that I'm speaking to is far more competent than they give their self credit for. Asking encouraging questions can make this person solve all the problems themselves and be able to be adaptively address critics. Like, unfortunately, being told what to do and giving the shortcut, I don't want to use the word shortcut, giving a lot of cutting to the chase kind of thing and whatnot, doesn't give the opportunity for the other person to feel useful in their own with their own devices. And over time, I do find students where you try too much of that, they become dependent on something. It could be you, and I don't want that. I personally, as a teacher, the most proudest moment, or as an educator, the proudest moment is when that student supersedes you and they can do anything without you, right? So yes, actually, that's actually one of the flaws of Duolingo, where the dependency, you can end up creating a dependency, which is what I feel most people refer to as Duolingo fluency. So you can end up being dependent on. What that tells me is the people who use Duolingo have something that is core, that's dependent on Duolingo. What is that? It's motivation. It, like, the order of things. When you say, oh no, Duolingo's problem is how accurate, the accuracy or comprehensiveness, right? Well before that is motivation. And to me, I think my critique of Duolingo is I hope the company will eventually do a lateral movement, or maybe even a earlier step to, it's usually lateral movement, like down here, to teach how to stay motivated. Because this skill still supersedes this skill. This is end goal stuff. When you focus on end goal stuff, it's like, well, you won't even get to its accuracy and comprehension. You can improve all the comprehension and accuracy you want. The grammar could be the most impeccable thing. Like, plenty of examples. Genki textbook. Any textbook is like more comprehensive. Then why doesn't it work? When you keep arguing, focusing on, why does the company find that their results keep backing, we should focus on motivation, we should keep focusing on motivation, we should keep engagement up? Why does the company not see the obvious answer that most people say is the problem? It's not. It's process oriented. If you aren't motivated first, you can't get to here. It could be the best resource in the entire world. It's not accessible. And what I mean by accessibility, I mean figuratively. Unlike people who use literal for everything, figuratively, it's not accessible. Because to a person's mind, you can't get them to motivate themselves. And I honestly think Duolingo has a very great shot at having an alternative course of alternative thinking. They may be a great opportunity to use it as a psychological exercise, a way to teach people, hey, what happens when Duolingo goes away? How can you take whatever you're learning from Duolingo's model and then apply it to anything else that Duolingo doesn't offer, right? If you take away the leaderboards, or you take away the design and the closed community and stuff, how do you create your own community? How do you use your imagination to make learning fun, right? When Duolingo goes away. So there aren't any characters. Would you invent a character? Because I do. I invent a story. All the things I read in a textbook, I invent stories when I read textbooks. That's how I got around all these things. Textbooks are funny and fun because there are stories in the textbook for me personally. So it's not because I don't like novels back then, or I don't have pleasure reading like fiction or something. When I read a textbook, I'm creating my own fiction too. So it's order. Order matters. I just happen to be able to benefit from textbooks, learning things, and still have my creativity engaged. However, if I didn't have that and I don't like textbooks, this could have came first. Order does matter. So it's one of those things. Why is Duolingo not boring right now? Is I don't usually only think about whatever's in front of me. I think about more than that. And that is a process that I actually think Duolingo can teach implicitly. I mean, explicitly. They can probably teach that explicitly if they want. Right now, they're using it implicitly. So how do they do it implicitly? Through social media. That's how they're keeping their people coming back at the expense of never reaching learning comprehension. Like, they are so good at this, right? That learning has become optional. The engagement is enough. What does that look like a lot of times? And that's my major concern. It looks like TikTok. You know, it looks like your YouTube algorithm. You don't have to learn anything to be happy, because this comes first, or engagement comes first. And that's kind of one of the things, like, how do you engage but give someone, reveal to someone why you're engaged? A lot of times they use data. I use data a lot. So for example, it would be awesome to have YouTube say, oh, this is what the algo is recommending because they noticed that you did this the last 10 days. Ask yourself what this means to you. Things like that. Something that makes it a little bit more explicit. Like, hey, have you noticed that you've been on Duolingo for... And Duolingo use some of this, like the chart with the XP. XP is kind of an indirect way of showing you these things. Competitive games show statistics to help gauge like how your performance is. But it can also lead to unintuitively, right? Those who find this unintuitive, what motivates you. And I can't, that's, if I had a focus of why I stream Duolingo use, is this. Implicitly, I want to use myself as an example, not because it could be better using like a hack or a short form thing. Is I want to demonstrate to people that it's a lot of things at the same time. And the more things you have, the more likely there aren't obstacles in your way. So like, I will humbly say that many of the obstacles that people see at the end game, right, the end goal of learning Japanese, will likely not happen to me, because I'm actively problem solving for those things. So in the end, I will likely agree with those people who have learned with an emotional expectation that didn't meet. I didn't start Duolingo thinking that this was the perfect tool, right? There's no part of my problem solving. I don't do things to not solve problems. It's kind of interesting that a lot of people wish that whatever they use don't have problems. No problems, right? I use the perfect tools. My life is perfect. I always know what the best thing to do. I don't run towards best things. When I have something to learn, I run towards problems. They're not my problems. There's whatever problems other people have. That's what makes me, I think that's what helps me solve other people's problems when they want to approach me. I can't help solve problems if my life is filled with no problems, right? Like, if I'm always doing the best thing, if my life is always perfect, I never solve problems because I always know what the perfect things to do. You, in my opinion, are a worse teacher. Teachers need to solve problems. Learning is the problem. Helping people learn. When you help someone and you're healthy and stuff, you have to run towards problems and see how you can fix them. You know, how to improve them, not how to ignore them. So when someone says stop using this, they're ignoring the problem. So they can't possibly tell you what the problem is anymore. Like, for example, Duolingo Japanese is awful. What's the problem? They do not teach kana. I actually had this. I legitimately, someone told me they do not teach kana. They do not teach kanji. They don't teach kanji. They don't use kanji even. Like, I actually heard someone tell me that Duolingo doesn't use kanji. Right? And it's probably some fluent person. Like, this person was clearly, like, knows Japanese really well. Is this helpful? No, it's not. It's actually deconstructive. It's actually misinformation. So, yeah, it can be tough. I'm not saying the person is malicious. The person is probably really kind-hearted and cares about the person to some extent. Right? It's tough. I think there are people who like to help people, and then there are people who like to help and can teach. Teaching is ironic, because if you spend time teaching, then you're not spending time mastering something. So if you ask yourself, your goal is to become the best native-like Japanese speaker ever, then you're not focusing on teaching. It doesn't actually make you a better teacher. In my opinion, it actually takes away from teaching most of the time, because you spend more time working on making yourself better than practicing skills to help other people. You are only helping yourself. That makes you more and more focused on yourself. So you start to convince yourself that there's a one-size-fits-all over and over again. Like, this is the best. This is what works for me. I only know this because I only practice these things. And the first thing that comes out of your mouth is you assume that that person is you from 10 years ago or from 15 years ago. And you give advice legitimately to derail that person, regardless of what that person is doing. That's projection. You are projecting your own experience, and you hope that all the advice you give makes them successful. Not in the best way, because it's your best way. You can't guarantee that. So whenever someone tells me like a heckin' three paragraph summary of like, oh, if you do this and this, you're more likely to get 10x the amount because you got the 10x amount, not me. Right? So teaching starts with the person you're teaching first, in my opinion. So park your arrogance and your pride at the door first, in my opinion. It sounded a little aggressive, but I mean, those guys are really good at Japanese. I don't think they have a problem if some novice, amateurish Japanese learner is criticizing them. I'm sure their pride will prop them up to a great extent. They're fluent in Japanese already, so it's not like I'm chipping away at their credibility. They're obviously very hardworking people who understand Japanese. But do not, in my opinion, I humbly argue that you are terrible at communication and terrible at teaching. As an exchange, that's the cost of being a fluent speaker, in my opinion. Like, I don't think I'm a very good English teacher, for example, because I didn't focus on teaching English. I focused on using English, right? That kind of thing. Deep cut, but I usually use myself as a great example.
このプリンターは便利ですね。
I'm terrible at teaching English. I only introduce exceptions, questions, and confusion whenever I speak English or talk about English, because I'm just not sure about anything. So when someone asks me like, do you have any tips for learning English? What's your native language? Possibly find someone who's a little ahead of you in that journey and look and observe what they're doing, and then go find another person and look and observe what they're doing, and then another person, and then another person. All that effort you take on finding out where you are with respect to where someone else is will make you naturally be able to pick up all the learning methods from them, and you get to pick and choose whichever one you want. That's my hot take, I would say. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. In the long run, it will help you with your second language, your third language, your fourth language. It doesn't even have to deal with language. You'll know what to look for to help you learn anything. Like, I need to learn physics now. What kind of person am I looking for to learn physics from? Right? Because you have an endless permutation of people. So now you're more focused on finding the right person or finding the right sources that meet your needs, as opposed to worrying about what you have to learn, when you have to learn it, how long it takes. The security you have is you're never worried when someone comes around and spreads fear, doubt, and uncertainty, FUD, F-U-D, you're not worried. Like when someone says, oh yeah, if you keep using Duolingo, you're practically going to waste hundreds of hours feeling regretful. Funny story. That's probably not going to happen. Statistically, 99% of the time for me, it's not going to happen. I didn't start Duolingo thinking that I was going to regret it. That's a very different perspective. The person that's talking to me that talks about that is likely someone who's very regretful. They are projecting their regret onto me without even knowing how regretful I am. Am I regretful at anything I've done? Not really. I can try very hard to think about a few things that I'm regretful for. Like, for example, not picking up someone when they fell down in public. Sometimes I do feel regretful for that. Like I witnessed someone fall down, but I told myself if that person needed help, they would reach out, right? They would, but then the back of my head would say, there's a chance, there's a time and place, but it's not dire at the moment. That person picked themselves up. Hopefully they go about their days. Those are the tiny little regrets that I feel almost obligated to think about for an evening or two, right? Every person that fell down that I can't pick up. Does that sound trivial to a lot of people? Some people might think like, oh yeah, don't let those things bother me. It's like, well, they don't bother me, right? I think about them though. They're important. What about all the people that I can't pick up when they fall down every second, every day, that kind of thing? If you can handle up to that point, if you can handle even sparing some time being concerned with things you can't control, then ultimately I give you a gold star, because then you've reached a state of mind where pretty much if anyone attacks you individually, you're worrying about things you can't control and you still feel happy. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being in life and you conquered nihilism. I don't think, if you told me like, yeah, you know, the world kind of sucks, there's all these things, but one day at a time. If you say something like that, I know you're a healthy person. If you're concerned about what if I start this and 3 years down the line, I'll regret everything I've done, then I'm worried about you. Just quite instinctively worried about you. Like, oh yeah, you shouldn't do this because it's the worst thing ever. I'm worried about you. Because what else do you think this way? Your relationships? I hope relationships are different for someone that says that. Because having a relationship with Japanese or learning Japanese is having a relationship with someone else is a step up from having a relationship with language learning. If you're so used to focusing on the best things on how to learn a language, you're not practicing, in my opinion, you're not even practicing transferable skills to having relationships with other people. So the way people advise me on Japanese, how open-minded they are about learning Japanese and critiquing products and stuff, if that is already disagreeable, nowhere in my mind do I think I can establish an interpersonal relationship with that person. Because ultimately, that's more important things. They will behave even more exaggerated. If you already get up in someone's case about the way they learn Japanese, then I can't possibly be friends with someone like that. Because it's even more important when it comes to friendship. So this person, you know, from 2 days ago used his friend as a sob story for his motivations. I'm definitely not that person. I don't resonate with that type of motivation. My friends, the people around me, they're brilliant. They have their struggles and whatnot, but I wouldn't use them to motivate my own selfish arrogance and pride. I would actually champion them. I would be thankful for them. You know, if it wasn't for, you know, you, Lotus, right? You, like, just thinking back, it's already been like 60 days, right? It's not that long, but if I had to think back, this experience would be incredibly different without our conversations. You know, Lotus, Indy, right? Even the occasional Blue, and then Victor. All those things are priceless, and it wouldn't have happened without Duolingo. What can you say? Would I trade it off for some like bee's knees, balls to the wall, fluency crash course using Anki and several other things? Nah, I wouldn't trade that up. Nah, I don't linger in the past. Like, but you know, if you use like LingQ, you would have been exposed to like 6 or 7 experts that know exactly what they're doing. It's like, yeah, that's not how this works. In hindsight, you know, after the fact, yes, it's very easy to know what you could and could not have done. That's not how life works, at least in my opinion. It's an unhealthy way to look at life. You live the present. Kind of like the Japanese language. They don't distinguish between the present and the future. If you're talking about it, it was already come to pass in the present. Right? I actually think that's pretty cool about the Japanese language. It's like, oh, but I would have done this. And I'm like, nah. It's fine. It's fine. Sorry. Just a little bit of a digression. Maybe I'll put that up for today. I don't know what it's going to be called, but something. Thanks, Lotus. Thanks for the inspiration. I also have to go to the bathroom. I'll be right back.